Orient is building a new digital financial services infrastructure to unlock economic opportunity for emerging Asia's underserved. Established in 2017 by co-founders of Sky and Lu.com, Orient has raised over $170 million in funding to use artificial intelligence and data science to build solutions that provide real-time credit scoring and other tailored financial services. To dig more into the story, the journey, and the future of Orient is Jennifer Sung, Chief Business Development Officer at LendEase. She will be moderating this chat with Jeffrey Prentice, co-founder of Orient. We'll now head over to Jennifer and Jeffrey for a closer look at Orient's founding.
Hi, Jeffrey. It's great to see you again.
Nice to see you. How are you?
I'm good. How are you today?
Sadly, I can't be there this year. The travel bubble never materialized. I'm in Hong Kong, so we'll have to do it this way this year.
I know it's unfortunate, but I'm hopeful next year when we are hosting the Singapore FinTech Festival again, you'd be here with us in person.
Of course.
Brilliant. Okay. So now that we already have an interesting introduction to Oriente, I'd like to start this conversation by delving, actually rewinding and going back into the past. Because, every time I meet a founder, I think the most intriguing question for me in particular is understanding how did they take the plunge. And you haven't done it once, twice, but thrice over. So if you could go back and you could tell us how did your entrepreneurial journey start? Like what led you to entrepreneurship? That would be very interesting.
Well, I mean, when I started my entrepreneurship thing was when we started Skype, which we started in Sweden. First of all, like my best friend, Nicholas, or one of my best friends, we started it together. We didn't know any better, so that was kind of the idea. And but I think when you're an entrepreneur, the most important thing is to find a solution that's standing in plain sight. So we understood that there's a huge opportunity in telecommunications, just like there's a huge opportunity in finance now. And that's what we did. So we just, woke up in the morning and started doing it one day and built it one by one. And then after that, I started Atomico, which is the biggest venture capital firm in Europe. But then I wanted to go back and do a startup again because I must have some, it's fun to be a part of something that you really control. So that's kind of how we ended up doing this. And so it's been, I like doing these startups. They're fun.
Interesting. And now I'm wondering, Jeffrey the venture capitalist or Jeffrey the startup founder, what do you prefer to be?
Depends on the day, right? I mean, being a venture capitalist is much easier because you root on your team, right? So I still have my portfolio from Atomico, and I can root on those guys from the distance, right? When it's this thing, you have more control, but then also you have more responsibility. So it's just a different kind of role. One is being a coach, and one is being a player. So they're very, very kind of different. So when I have a bad day, I want to be a venture capitalist. When I'm a good day, I want to be a founder.
Absolutely, I can understand. Now, in terms of, because again, this is not the first time, this is the third time over that you're starting out. Now, tell me, does it really get easy the second or third time around? Or are there challenges because obviously you kind of know the drill, but at the same time, you have a legacy to sort of safeguard? What are your views on that?
But that's a really important point you brought up is that you know it's coming to a certain point. So like when I started Skype, we all thought it'd be flowers and unicorns and everything would be very, very happy and fun all the time. This is great to be a founder. I wouldn't have to wear a suit anymore. This is fantastic, right? You have all those kind of ideas. But then when you go through it and understand the pain you go through, there's a lot of positive, but you go through pain as well. So when you start this, like my wife is like, oh my God, don't do this again. I can't believe you're doing this again. Because there's going to be bumps along the road. You don't know what the bumps are going to be, but they're going to come. So, I mean, better the second time, but then also having that not knowing is also a very valuable thing. So they both have their positives and negatives.
Absolutely true. And I think it's so important as a startup founder to have the right support system in terms of a strong family, a strong partner, who's willing to see you take that plunge time and again. And I think one thing that I personally feel happens a lot is there's a lot of, if you look in the media, there's a lot of glorification of entrepreneurship in terms of, you get stories of companies becoming unicorns and fundraisers and milestones being achieved, but nobody talks about how stressful it is and the mental health impacts of entrepreneurship. So in terms of preserving your sanity, what kind of tips and tricks have you used and what do you advise founders that you work with or you mentored in the course of being a VC investor?
That's really important. You can't do this alone. That's the number one thing. It's impossible to do alone. Now, if you're, Fortune magazine or whatever, TechCrunch or whatever, they want to have pictures of one person on there because it makes it easier, right? It's better to have, glorified as one person, but that's not at all how it happens, because there's just no way that one person can deal with it. Because there are days or a couple of days, and founders don't talk about, but it's true, where you almost check out. You're like, man, I can't not do this anymore. I'm tired. And someone else has got to pick you up and say, no, we got to keep going. You got to have that support system. So people trying to do things on their own is no way. And it's not like one person doing it. You know what I mean? You have to have that support. And you also bring up the point. One thing is the support system within your company, but also outside of your company. That's very, very, very important, And I think like for Singapore, it's really interesting because when we started Skype in Sweden and Estonia, there weren't many other startups there. So when things were screwing up, you had no one really to talk to. That was hard. The beauty of the Silicon Valley is you have a lot more people around. And Singapore is going more towards Silicon Valley, but it's still a little bit like Stockholm was back in the old days when we started it, that you don't have a ton of support systems. So that's why it's important that you have your family or friends just to be able to talk to about this stuff.
Interesting. At the same time, like you mentioned, it's very important to have, somebody that you can share the startup experience with, which is why I think a lot of people seek out co-founders to sort of build the venture out. But apart from looking out for co-founders, hiring the right kind of talent at an early stage, I think, is one of the big challenges that, startups face all across the globe. So how do you think you tackle the challenge of attracting the right kind of people to work with in the early days? And what other challenges did you face in your journey building out both Skype and Oriente?
Well, the most important thing is you'll be shocked at who you can bring on board when you start a company. People want to follow people who are excited about something. When we first started Skype, we hired a couple. How the heck did this person? Why would they ever want to work with us? We stink. We're small. What's the point? But people do have that view. Oh, if you were really passionate about this stuff, that's important. That's the kind of the important thing that you can't realize the people you can bring on board. So I think the one thing I tell all of my companies is, okay, if you see that lady over there that's done this amazing stuff, go ask her to work for you or go work with you together. You'll be surprised what the answer will be. You'll be very surprised what the answer will be. It might not be yes, but it might be like, oh, can I still help in some way? I know some people, etc. So that's the point. Aim for people you cannot possibly imagine would want to work for your rinky-dink, stinky startup. Because actually, in reality, you'll be surprised how many do.
I think that's very true. I think it's always a matter of being able to ask the question, and then you never know, it may not be a yes, but it may still be something interesting and better than what you expected it to be. And I think as a startup founder, you have to sort of go out of your comfort zone to ask for questions, ask for help, ask for funding. So it is a tough journey. So in terms of, again, you've been an entrepreneur for 2 decades now, like starting out with Skype, then Atomico, and now Oriente. If you could look back in time, what kind of leadership advice would you give to yourself?
Well, number one, don't be too hard on yourself. That's the first thing. You're going to screw up. That's the first thing. You got to look in the mirror and say, okay, this is going to happen. This is that you're human. Because again, what you brought up is important. It's there's this glorification of founders, and all these founders are discussing how wonderful Airbnb went public yesterday. It's so wonderful, et cetera. Well, Airbnb had a hard time raising money in the Series A, and I know they had a hard time raising it. Even their $2.5 billion valuation round, really hard. So, it's not that easy, but you're not going to hear about that. You're never going to hear about that. They're going to hear about, the really smart guy at Goldman Sachs, everyone on Twitter saying, I got an email and I invested. So you're always hearing the glorification parts. You know what I mean? That's the thing that understand that you're going to feel alone, that you're going to feel depressed, they're going to have all these kind of feelings. You have to understand that part. And I think that's the important part. It's not always it's not always wonderful, but in the end, of course, it's great. But I think that's the most important thing for founders to understand. Everyone always thinks the other founder, the other company across the street, everything works perfect. There's no problems. And then when you realize, that was the thing that I realized when I started Atomico, you start investing, you go, oh my God, every startup's a piece of junk. Every startup's a mess. That's how they all are. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter. Then that's just kind of how it kind of goes. So that's the important thing. Don't try to be a perfectionist and don't think it's perfect. Just, be your kind of self, personality-wise, and keep driving.
I think that's very good advice. Thanks, Jeff. Now, is there anything in your entrepreneurial journey that you would do differently, looking back?
Oh, man, I would do most everything differently.
Give me the big one.
Most of the time. Well, probably I wouldn't have sold to Microsoft because, it's Skype at the beginning. That would probably be it. But again, I think the Not trusting in yourself very often was a hard thing when we first started. Like saying, "Oh, I don't know if we can really do that. Can we really do that, etc." Right? Like just trusting that. Like, why can't I? Like, I had no telecom experience when I started. So what we did at the beginning, for example, is we hired too many telecom people. That was a big problem. So what I've seen a lot of times is you have people who are taking over an industry and sometimes overhire from people from the legacy industry who then tell them what can and cannot be done. So we'll use the Skype example. We had this SIP protocol was this thing that people used. Everyone connected via the SIP protocol. But our engineers figured out that had gaming backgrounds. They didn't know was like, you know what, actually, like, SIP protocol doesn't work very well. And so we're like, we'll just forget that. We'll use this other one. Well, then we had hired 3 telecom people, and they're like, oh, no, you have to use SIP protocol. And you're like, well, why do we have to use this? And they're like, because everyone always uses it. It's like, well, I don't care. It doesn't work. Like, so sometimes we try to hire people from the legacy businesses that we were in industries, and it's actually sometimes it's much better to hire someone who is brand new, doesn't know anything about the industry, and have them build it with you.
I think that's a very interesting take in terms of how you build your team out. Like if you're building, say, a fintech business, do you hire people who only worked in finance and banking and similar institutions, or do you bring on board interesting people from different backgrounds and see what they concoct?
Yeah, find really smart people who want to solve problems. That's it. I mean, because again, like if you have that background in that field, you tend to run into a problem because you start to create something that you're trying to disrupt. Right? Because I mean, because that's what you've done before. So we've had, even at Oriente, you have that problem. You hire people who are great in said background, but then they're like building the same thing that you're trying to disrupt. You know what I mean? And it's like, we don't want that. That's not the point. You know? So that's how we've always been quite successful.
Absolutely. There has to be a right balance between experience and legacy issues that you can bring to a startup. Incredible. So Jeff, what personally intrigues me is the fact that you were building out Skype out there in the West, and then you were leading their expansion in emerging markets, including Asia, if I'm correct. Mm-hmm. And then the second time around, after 7 years of successfully running, and investing with Atomico, you decided to be an entrepreneur again, and you chose to do it in financial technology in emerging Asia. But why? Why fintech? Why Asia? Why like a few years ago? Like why now?
Okay, so real quick. So basically at Skype, I was in charge of everything kind of business related. So I was in charge of the fundraising, the business development, expansion, et cetera. And people don't know this, but Skype's biggest market was China, actually. It was our #1 market. Asia was over half of our user base. And I was kind of driving that especially. Because I'm like, there's no way that like Microsoft or Yahoo will talk to us rinky-dink company from Stockholm, but maybe Rakuten and, the Chinese companies will. So that's kind of how we did that. So I spent most of my time in Asia. And then after Atomico, like, I think it's very simple to kind of think about what industries are going to be disrupted next. Basically, get a look at the GDP pie and see what are the biggest parts of GDP globally and go after those markets. So we did telecommunication, that was done. So basically the last 2 big ones left were finance and healthcare. So I said, well, my old guy who I worked with at eBay, the head of technology, he was the first employee at Lufax. So I said, hey, why don't we take on Southeast Asia for financial services? I have no finance background in particular. And so then we decided to kind of go after that. And we partnered with the big JG Summit, the second biggest conglomerate in the Philippines, and Cinemas, the second biggest in Indonesia, and kind of build it out that way. That was kind of the idea. That was all, it's that simple.
And how do you see the differences in, again, like it's also a different time frame, but how do you see a difference in building like a startup in Southeast Asia versus building a startup in Europe? Are there any significant differences that you felt in the course of those 2 journeys?
Massive. So I'm an investor at Atomico. We're a big investor in Klarna, which is a great company that we love. Sebastian and the team is fantastic. And the difference is, so if you look at emerging markets and you look at, let's say, developed markets, they're very, very different. Because what I saw in China when I was building out Skype in the early 2000s was basically they were building an infrastructure, okay? There was nothing that existed there. There was the communication system wasn't great, et cetera, right? So you had to build an infrastructure and go that way. If you look at like what Ping An Insurance has done so far, they built out products for people that never had any other products, where in the developed world, everything already exists. So Klarna is disrupting existing companies. At Oriente or any finance system in Southeast Asia, I mean, outside of Singapore and emerging Asia, you're building something that doesn't exist. So basically in the Philippines, who do you borrow from? The biggest borrower for a consumer is Cebuana, the biggest pawn shop there. And it's basically your mother-in-law. Those are the 2 people you're borrowing money from, right? It's not like banks. So if you're Klarna in a developed world, you go after a very specific small thing and you kind of build out from that because the infrastructure is already there. Where in emerging Asia, it's like there's nothing here. You need to build the rails yourself, and then you can drive the whole system. So it's a very different way. What is an infrastructure play in emerging markets? And when you talk about a developed world, you're kind of disrupting something that already exists.
That is very true.
Does that make any sense?
It does. Thank you, Jeff. And that's very true again, like in emerging Asia where there's lack of infrastructure, and there's a fair amount of investment that has to go in to ensure that you develop the right kind of infrastructure and get the right kind of scale before entrepreneurs like start thinking about things like profitability. Which brings me to the next question about, again, like you've been on both sides of the table. You've been an investor, you've been an entrepreneur. And historically, we've seen that when technology startups start out, the initial guidelines are to sort of scale, expand to different markets, like grow, develop their product, profitability. Like earlier, you used to take a back seat. But in the light of the current coronavirus pandemic, we've seen the messages from all the VCs this year were to tighten the belts, reduce the burn, and start focusing on profitability more than it was done previously. And again, fundraising was also going to become difficult. So I'm trying to understand, how have you seen this shift in attitudes or towards how to build a venture in emerging markets or emerging Asia in particular? And do you think this is just a blip, or do you think this is going to be a sustainable shift in the VC attitude towards investments?
Oh, VCs changed their tune like crazy. I mean, if you saw Sequoia came out and said we have to everybody better start tightening their belts, and look what they've done with Airbnb and Klarna, et cetera. They've done the best year of their whole entire history of the firm. So they got that completely wrong. I think, you should always have an eye on profitability. That's important. I think that people don't mind, and I'm putting my Atomico hat on, people don't mind if you're burning, but they want to know that you're burning, that if you want to change that direction, you can. They don't want burning to nowhere. So what happens with startups, think, well, I'll just kind of burn money to kind of grow. But it's like, no, you have to be able to make clear that your unit economics have integrity, that they can work. But what you've decided to do is grow, to spend more to grow your market share. So there's a difference between just burning and using that money to expand. There's a very, very, very big difference. So you have to make sure that the thing that you're building has integrity to be profitable, but that you've decided not to be profitable to grow the business. There's a big difference there. And sometimes the hardest thing you got to do as an investor, and we focus mostly on growth stage stuff at Atomico, was finding out which one it is. Is this burn to nowhere? Is this a bridge to nowhere? Or is this actually something where they just decided to kind of put the foot on the gas to kind of make this thing grow?
Absolutely.
Sometimes you find out later on that they were wrong. You're like, oh no, you know what I mean? This is a burn to nowhere.
Only time will tell, Jeff. Only time will tell. All right, so let's do a status check on how was 2020 for you and Oriente.
Well, it's been quite an interesting journey, that's for sure. We had to tighten our belts like everybody else. Anything related to lending is different here. I mean, the difference you have in emerging Asia versus the developed markets, which one of my investors who's quite big told me was, he's like, the difference in the emerging Asia is that in the developed world, that the governments are bailing out business. In emerging Asia, businesses are bailing out the government. It's a different way of looking at it. They don't have the same. They can't print money. They don't have any of those levers. So that kind of brought things down. But we're still will be bigger than we were last year by quite a bit. We've grown quite a bit. What it's done is it's shaken out a lot of competitors, like you talked about, the ones that couldn't get their burn under control, the ones that were kind of bridged to nowhere. That's what's happened a lot. So it's taken a lot of froth out of the market. So for that, it's been very, very good for us. The froth has been taken out, so you can have conversations with partners that are much more logical than they were before.
That's true. I think in the beginning, when we were speaking to different investors, the general overview was we don't know what kind of players will survive or tide over the pandemic. And I think now we're starting to see signs of the stronger players emerge out much stronger. And I think particularly in digital lending, to my surprise, in particular, I saw a lot of interesting equity fundraisers happening, fairly large ticket sizes being raised, in this part of the world, including Oriente's ongoing Series B. So congratulations on that. And but again, I think in general, the fundraising environment has been relatively subdued as compared to previous years. So are there any fundraising tips that you want to offer to all the entrepreneurs that are tuning in and trying to prepare themselves for in the upcoming months in 2021?
Well, happy days are here again on some level. So you should be if you survive Q2 and Q3, you're in a much better place. I would agree with you that the funding environment, let's say in Europe or the US and China, has been much more robust than in emerging markets because, and one of the major reasons is for the fact that there are fewer funds obviously here, and there are also newer funds. So these newer funds are like, they have very new LPs, they haven't had a relationship for 10, 20 years. So they're kind of like, they invest like, do you really want to put more money into this? Do you really want to do this? That kind of thing is more difficult, which founders don't understand, that actually the VC has bosses too. Just like you have bosses, they have bosses. You know, your boss is the VC and their boss are the LPs. So, I mean, but I think now we're coming out the other side of that stuff, but still, people want to make sure, like I was saying before, that you have a path from A to B to get to where you want to get. The most important thing to do is when you raise money, to be clear that the money you're going to raise now is all the money you will ever need. That is the most important thing to understand. Now, that can change. Of course, you'll probably raise more rounds, but you want to make sure that that is all the money you will need. People do not want to hear now, especially now, that like, oh no, here's our Series A and then Series B and then Series C. Like, we need 3 more rounds before we'll be profitable. That doesn't excite people. So you got to be very careful that you have sort of a path to, this is the last fundraise I can always have.
Absolutely. I think at this point, it's very important to sort of have a very clear vision on how you're going to utilize those funds and ensuring that they tide you over for as long as possible without being dependent on the next round of funding. Because again, in the time of such global economic turmoil and uncertainty, the entrepreneurs need to be slightly on the conservative side while trying to grow their business. I think my next question.
Well, the oldest saying, and the most important thing always is like people say this about like in the developed world. It's like buying a house. Like you can only borrow money when you don't need any money, right? That's how it is. You can only get a mortgage for your house if you don't need money. If you really need money, no one will ever give it to you.
Well, that's the hard truth that all the entrepreneurs have to live with. Okay, so getting into my next question. So again, like we're still in the middle of a global pandemic, and when people start thinking about entrepreneurship, you're trying to figure out, is this the right time to take the plunge? Because if you think about, the first wave of fintechs that came about in the US, they happened right around GFC. So now the question is, if somebody came to you today and asked you for advice on, is this the right time to get out there and build a fintech business in Asia, what would your answer be?
If you have a solution for it, it's always the right time. I mean, we started Skype in Sweden in 2002 when that was the worst time, because Sweden was the land of Ericsson, Nokia. It was a wasteland. We started raising our first fund for Atomico the day Lehman collapsed, right? I mean, these were bad times to start things, but it doesn't matter. It just takes longer to raise your fund, et cetera. But the reality is that you just got to keep on. If you have the right solution, you'll get there at some point. You know what I mean? You might get there faster or slower. It's about having the right solution to a problem that matters the most, not sort of timing. Like timing starting a startup doesn't, timing the market doesn't work. Let alone, as a stock investor, let alone trying to time when you're going to start your startup. You start it when you have the right idea.
Thank you for sharing that, Jeff. Now, I think we're getting towards the tail end of our conversation, so I have 2 big questions for you. The first one being, how have you seen, like again, Oriente started in 2017. You've been looking at Asia and active in Asia for way longer than that. So how have you seen the general startup ecosystem and in particular the fintech ecosystem evolve in this part of the world? And what are you excited about in 2021 in terms of fintech developments?
Well, I think the first thing is, Europe is very similar to Southeast Asia in the way that we were. There was nothing there. And what's happened is the speed of this. And Singapore's been at the heart of it. I mean, it's pretty remarkable how fast the ecosystem is growing. That's one thing I can tell you. Things are just going much, much faster. The ecosystem here has grown much, much faster. I mean, I remember when we started Skype, Mary Meeker said we're the fastest growing consumer brand in human history. And now it's like the slowest thing ever. You know what I mean? Like these things have gone much, much faster. So I think the ecosystem is really built out quite quickly and quite rapidly. I think for 2021, what am I excited about? I think the fact is now you're getting sort of an infrastructure layer that's being laid on top here. And now you're going to be able, and there's different pieces to the puzzle. So you're going to start seeing much more purpose-based companies developing here. Not just just payment companies, right? Or whatever. There's now a lot more things. There's a lot more people collecting, understanding what to do with credit scoring, understanding these different pieces. So it's going to be the ones that now is not just building the infrastructure, but also the ones who can start leveraging that infrastructure to build things on top. So for example, what I mean by that is smartphones came first, And then you had Uber, which built on top of that. Without smartphones, there can be no Uber, right? So we built this infrastructure. Now other things sit on top of that.
I think that's very true because I think in Southeast Asia, I mean, outside Singapore, emerging Asia, it's particularly true that the infrastructure, I think, has seen an evolution over the last few years. And as, again, the technology infrastructure gets better, it becomes easier to build solution layers on top of it and probably, develop more interesting fintech solutions to help the consumers going forward. And as you said, build purpose-based companies that sort of help the end consumer reach their goals. So again, towards the end, what parting words of wisdom for the fellow entrepreneurs in the audience who are trying to build out a business, are struggling to figure out where to start, who to approach, where to get money from? Anything that you want to share at this point, Jeff?
Well, I don't have much. I'm not a wisdom. I don't live in a cave. I'm not Yoda. I'm not like that. But I just remember I always tell this story. When we first started Skype, me and Nicholas were out having a couple adult beverages. Then the next day we said, okay, we're going to start Skype. And we go into the office and we're like, okay, let's start. And then we're like, okay, now what do we do? No idea what to do. And the first thing I ever did was get the domain name, right? And it was called Skyper, but that was also Deutsche Telekom's paging service. So we said, okay, we can't do that. We'll get Skype. And we were so happy. And the first thing we did was we got a domain name. And then the point is, though, you just keep building from there. You know what I'm saying? And every day that goes by, you can't believe how little you got done and didn't make any progress, and today sucks, and I hate this, I hate my founder, and everything else. And then you go look back 6 months later, you can't believe what you accomplished. So it's just sit down and just start. That's all.
That's incredible. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for sharing, for being so candid, and for sharing all of this with me and the audience today. It's been an absolutely wonderful discussion, and hopefully next year when we have SFF, or even sooner than that, you can take it to Singapore finally.
Fantastic. I was supposed to be here, and now I can't. I wanted to get out of town, but sadly, I'll have to wait until the beginning of next year.
It's all right. We can cross our fingers and hope for the best. I'm feeling really optimistic about what's to come in 2021, both in terms of the global situation and fintech. So let's see. Anyways, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Truly the spirit of a founder. Just go in and get it done. Thank you very much for that, Jeffrey and Jennifer, for giving us a look into the founder story of Oriente and the work that goes into unlocking opportunity for Asia's underserved population.